All right, we are live. Big news coming out of Ukraine yesterday. We're going to be talking about exactly what happened. More than 20 European countries called on Vladimir Putin to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Ukraine immediately agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, and this is unconditional, sea, air, and land. Russia, not so much. We're going to talk about why, and we're going to break all this down. But folks, thank you for watching CBN News. I'm Chuck Holton. I'm coming to you from the CBN studios in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Actually, I'm in the meeting room, but this is not the actual studio, but it works. And I'm going to be going live on Gary Lane's show, The Global Lane, later on today. But anyway, coming to you from Virginia Beach, Virginia. And we're going to be talking about all of the developments in the war between the United States and, I'm sorry, the United States, between the United States and Russia and Europe, because that's really what this war is. Ukraine, as I've always said, is just the football here. And the contest is actually between Russia and the West. And the objective has very little to do with territorial expansion or denazification or demilitarization or anything like that in Ukraine. More so, it has to do with creating a bipolar world, a multipolar world, where the United States and the West do no longer have hegemony over the planet and get to set the rules of global order. And so that's what this has always been about. It's definitely become the objectives have changed and morphed as time has gone on. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about the impact that it's had both on Ukraine and on Russia. But as we get started, I just want to point out the what's most important to me about this contest between Russia and Ukraine is the human cost. It's not, uh, you know, I'm not as concerned with who's winning, who's losing, who's corrupt, who's not. I mean, if you're of the mind that, well, Ukraine is a corrupt country, well, perhaps, but if you overlook the fact that Russia is a spectacularly corrupt country, then you're just being intellectually dishonest. And as I've often said, if you're saying that from the United States and you don't think the United States has any corruption in our political system, you are mistaken beyond a shadow of a doubt. So, I mean, to say that a large bureaucracy is corrupt is sort of being redundant, right? And I'm looking for a let's see, Orihiv. I'm looking for a photograph that I want to show you here. And the reason is that this is, to me, what this contest is all about and what we need to focus on most when it comes to dealing with this conflict. So in November of 2022, I went to Zaporizhia. And then from Zaporizhia, I went down to a village called Orihiv, which is at that time was right on the dividing line between Russian forces and Ukrainian forces. It was about 1 mile from the front line. And it's a small village, but it was being relentlessly shelled by Russia with mortars and artillery coming in on a daily basis. So most people in the village had fled, but there were some people who had not. The reason that they didn't flee is because some people feel like they can't. They don't have any way to flee. They've never traveled. It's not uncommon in remote parts of Ukraine to run into people who literally have never left the area where they were born. Maybe never traveled more than 25 miles from the place where they were born. And so they don't have a passport. They've never traveled. They don't know how to even begin to go about traveling. They don't know anybody anywhere else that they could go stay with or anything like that. And they don't have any money. So all of those things combined to sort of hold them there in the war zone, even though they're about to be overrun by enemy forces. And every time you go to the front lines in Ukraine, you run into this problem. You see these people who are actually trying to live in the area where the fighting is happening and just sort of go about their lives. It's nuts. But I went and met a pastor and his wife in Orihiv who had stayed. They had the wherewithal to leave if they wanted to, had a vehicle, and they had places to go. They could have left, but they had chosen to stay to minister to the people who could not leave. Those people were hiding out in basements and bunkers full time. It was winter time, and so they were having to heat with wood and terrible smoke and that sort of thing. Getting food was a challenge, so the pastor and his wife would go pick up food in the bigger city of Zaporizhia and then come down and bring it to Orihiv to feed the people and give out free food. The most of the members of their church that was there before the war started had fled, but their church had actually refilled with people who didn't go to church before, but started going to the church because of their faithfulness to the community, staying there and helping out. Well, over time, Orihiv was just getting pounded into dust, and the Russians would advance and get closer and almost take the town and then get pushed back by Ukrainian forces. And so it just became a place where it was untenable to live anymore. And everybody was telling the pastor and his family they needed to get out. Well, I spent the night with them in Orihiv while I was there in November 2022. And this was me with the family. You see there the older couple up there, that's the husband and wife. And then they have their daughter and their oldest daughter here. I'm sorry, their son married to his wife, and he and his wife had a little girl here. And then this is their younger daughter for the pastor and his wife. And they were all staying there together. And as the night fell and the barrage started of artillery, what you saw was I heard them talking in the other room. I heard them in the other room, and I was like wondering what was going to happen. And so I went and looked through the curtain into the other room, and the whole family was in there around the kitchen table, holding hands and praying. And they did that as long as the barrage lasted. And I found out later that's what they do every time the barrage of artillery or whatever comes, is they would gather around the table and pray. And one time, one of the artillery shells landed about 15 feet from the back of their house in their garden and would have destroyed their house, but it didn't blow up. It was a dud. So they took that as proof that prayer works and were just very faithful people. I was really impacted by spending time with that family. Well, as the years went on, again, it just became untenable for them to stay. The missionary man and his family, they and his wife, decided they were still not going to leave, and they're still there to this day. But they sent the son and his young wife and their daughter to Kiev in order to go somewhere a little bit safer. They didn't really have any place to live when they got to Kiev, so they went to a church that they were affiliated with, and the church let them stay in an apartment above the church, and that's where they were staying. When this is this guy here at the bottom and his wife and their daughter right there in pink, right there. Okay, those three went to Kiev and were staying in an apartment above a church. And one night recently, three drones came in from Russia, and all three struck that church and destroyed the church. And the husband and the little girl were killed, and the wife was injured but is still alive now without her family. So just to see them again, that young couple there and the little girl in pink. The husband and the little girl were murdered by Russian drones. The wife was injured and is now recovering, but she may never recover fully, mentally at least, after losing her entire family. I wanted to tell that story at the beginning of this live just so that you understand the human cost of what's happening in Ukraine. These are people that are faithful Christians. They're our brothers and sisters in Christ. They didn't have any problem with Russia before the war. They certainly had no desire to attack Russia. And indeed, Ukraine did not attack Russia. Russia attacked Ukraine. And Russia has been murdering people in Ukraine every day since February 22nd, 2022. So it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about the cost of this war. But first, let's talk about the ceasefire that has been called for by the European Union and what that means. Okay, so the proposal is a joint call from France, Germany, the UK, Poland, and other European nations, about 20 in all. Their demand is for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire across all domains of battle, land, sea, and air. They should have included information in that and asymmetric war, but good luck. The proposed start date was midnight tonight. Now it's just after 7 p.m. in Kyiv, so Russia theoretically has about 5 hours to come around and decide whether they want to participate in this ceasefire. But it's unconditional. Like we just want to stop the killing so that we can create some space for diplomatic negotiations so that they can get together, Russia and Ukraine, directly and talk about what it will take to end the war. Now, if you've been following this at all, you know that Russia has not shown any interest really in ending the war in any way except by destroying Ukraine. And it bears repeating, we should all keep in mind that of the two combatants in this conflict, if Russia stops fighting tomorrow, the war will be over. If Ukraine stops fighting tomorrow, Ukraine will be over. And that's the difference. This is a war of choice on the part of Russia, and it's a war of necessity on the part of Ukraine. It's very important to keep that in mind. So I don't care if you think Ukraine is corrupt. I don't care if you don't like Vladimir Zelensky. None of that actually matters when it comes to, does Ukraine as a nation have a right to exist? Now, if you think that Ukraine as a nation does not have a right to exist, then we don't have anything to talk about. You don't need to watch the rest of this live. You might as well just go watch something else, because you're not going to agree with anything else that is said here today. But if Ukraine has the right to exist as a nation, then they have more than a right to fight for their country. They have a duty to fight for it. And indeed, Ukrainians are very patriotic people, and they believe in their country. They believe in their language and their culture, Ukrainian culture. They are not Russian, no matter what Vladimir Putin says. But this is a war of choice on the part of the Russians. And so you're going to want to keep that in mind as we talk about the costs to Russia so far in this war and act as a confidence building measure to show that both sides want peace. And that's really what this is. Because I'll promise you that these European countries and the Ukrainians, they know that Russia has no interest in peace whatsoever. They don't want peace other than peace brought through the sword that comes from destroying Ukraine. And that's a non-starter for the EU and for Ukraine, obviously. And so what they're trying to do is get Russia to show their true face to the world. Because what Russia does is they hem and haw and they say, well, we are willing to talk about beginning the discussions of potentially thinking about moving toward a framework that might build on a peace process that would eventually get us to thinking about starting to talk about a peace deal. I mean, that's essentially what Russia has been doing since the beginning. Every time somebody's brought up negotiations for peace, they don't have any interest in a peace process. But apparently, Vladimir Putin was, at least for a while, able to pull the wool over the eyes of the administration in the United States and make President Trump think that they did care about a peace deal. And Trump thought he could make it happen. And so he invested time and effort into getting the two sides to the table. Ukraine would immediately come to the table and say, we're here. Let's do it. Let's talk about a peace process, even if it means giving up portions of our sovereign territory. And Russia would hem and haw and say, well, we're thinking about talking about at some point starting to believe that a framework could exist in some world where peace could possibly be a process. That's all they'll do. And they got to the point where literally President Trump just threw up his hands and said, all right, forget it. You guys are, obviously, you don't want peace, and I'm out. Now, that's a far cry from his very bold claims during the elections that he would bring peace within 24 hours in Ukraine, as if, oh, the answer was just so easy. Well, as it turns out, the answer is not near as easy as he thought it was or tried to convince his base that it was. And it was apparently too difficult for him to bring peace or bring both sides to the table. It was beyond President Trump's ability to do. And so he just threw up his hands and said, all right, forget it. You guys are on your own. At that point, the European Union came together and said, it doesn't look like we can trust the United States to be a partner in helping us bring peace in our continent in this case. So since we can't trust President Trump and the United States at the moment, we're going to do it ourselves. And 20 of those leaders got on a train and went to Kyiv and met with President Zelensky in a wartime environment and had a big public gathering where they stood up. And each one of those leaders called on President Putin to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire just to create the room that it would need to actually start the peace process. Just stop the killing. Well, to that, Russia said, how about not? President Putin held an emergency press conference, kept everybody waiting until midnight, night before last, finally came out and did his little, the Ukrainians are actually Russians and are part of Russia, and you have to denazify and, blah, 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 all that. And it spent an hour saying absolutely nothing and did what everybody with three brain cells to rub together knew that he would do, which is just hem and haw and try to kick the can down the road a little further. And that's exactly what he did. He said, well, 24 hours to, come up with a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Just not in the realm of possibility for us. So we're gonna. I mean, why? You just send the order. Stop killing. So we will think about starting to talk about a peace process in Turkey on the 15th of May, just a couple days later. Today's the 12th. So you might say, well, that's not such a big deal. It's just a couple days difference. Well, President Zelensky said, okay, fine, let's talk in Turkey. I'll be there on my way. We'll see if President Putin shows up. Well, everybody knows, and I can virtually guarantee you, President Putin will not show up to those talks. He may send a lower level delegation to try to meet with President Zelensky to stall and to hem and haw some more. But what we do know is that Russia is not interested in peace. Now, you might say that's because Russia is winning. And why would they talk peace if they're actually winning? Well, since November 2022, when I went to Zaporizhia and went to Oryiv, the front line in that area has literally, it's fluctuated by about 1 kilometer, but they've never overtaken Oryiv, which was just 1 mile from the front lines in November 2022. The Russians, since that time, since November 2022, have managed to capture 1% of Ukraine's landmass. 1 additional percent of Ukraine's landmass. And the cost to Russia has been staggering. Absolutely staggering. Okay? So let's start with military losses here. Ukraine's intelligence directorate keeps a running toll of what they believe the casualty figures are on the Russian side. And you can discount what they say because they are one of the combatants. Even if they're telling the truth, you can't really believe what they say because they're one of the combatants. And they have a vested interest in making the casualty figures look worse than they actually are. And they say that Russia is over 980,000 casualties so far in this war. But if you look at non-biased third-party open source intelligence organizations like Bellingcat and others, or other countries' intelligence services like the UK that are a little more, or the United States, that are a little more trustworthy, perhaps, because we don't have direct skin in that game. They will say that Russia has lost between 300,000 and 350,000 dead. That's a city, folks. That's a large city worth of people. And mostly young military age males, virtually all. This for a country that was already at like a 1.1 replacement rate, which is far below the 1.6 needed to be out of terminal decline, or the 2.1 needed to maintain their population. What I'm saying is that the Russian race will die out. And that's not an opinion, that's just arithmetic. The Russian race will soon be no more because they're just not having any babies. And they just killed off 350,000 of their, breeding age stock, to say nothing of the probably 1.6 to 2 million young men who have fled the country and gone elsewhere. The Russians, the troops that they have lost are their most experienced troops. They've gotten to the point where they're emptying out their prisons and recruiting prisoners to go fight in meat wave assaults against Ukraine. The United States Central Intelligence Agency believes that Russian losses in Ukraine have set back their military modernization by 18 years, meaning it would take them 18 years just to get back to the place where they were at the beginning of the war. which, as they found out very rapidly after the war began, Russian military hardware and Russian military tactics were sadly lacking when put up against Western military hardware and Western military tactics. Russia has lost more than 3,600 tanks. Their most capable and modern tanks have been decimated on the battlefield. They've lost more than 8,000 armored vehicles. They've had significant losses of aircraft, helicopters, artillery. The value of the equipment losses amount to between 60 and 100 billion dollars. Now, Russia has been mobilizing their entire economy in order to try to militarize it and crank out more military equipment. But the rate that they're making new tanks, for example, and the rate that they're losing tanks is like this. So they can make a few tanks a year. They're losing a few tanks a month. The wider economic impact, though, on Russia is where they're really hurting. And so all of this is pretty easily verifiable data. For example, the Fed funds rate, or the rate which banks can lend to each other inside Russia, is 21%. Absolutely mind-boggling that high. I mean, there's no possible way anybody's going to be able to get a mortgage. That'd be like putting a house on your credit card. Pre-war growth projections have plummeted by 5 or 6% a year. Their gross domestic product in 2022 contracted by 2.1%. That's $104 billion of lost output in Russia. And that's just in 2022. We're 3 years past that now. And it has gotten worse every year. In 2022, the inflation rate in Russia went up to 17%. It's much higher than that now. At this point, the Russians are only surviving because they have what's called a sovereign wealth fund. Excuse me. They had a couple $100 billion set aside from oil profits, and they're now living on that because the revenues from oil and natural gas have plummeted to a point where they're not, if they had to pay for this war just with what they're bringing in from taxes and tariffs and revenues to the government through oil and natural gas, there's no way they could prosecute the war any longer. The sanctions have proved to be pretty easy to circumvent. However, they have taken a bite out of the Russian economy. They've had more than $300 billion in foreign reserves frozen. All major Russian banks have been cut off from the Western world in terms of the SWIFT banking protocols and being able to transfer money around and things like that. Just makes it very difficult for Russia to do business with any Western countries. Technology, defense, and aerospace sectors have been heavily impacted because it's much harder for them to get the advanced stuff that they need to, be able to build new missiles and new tanks and new aircraft carriers or aircraft and things like that. Over 1,000 foreign companies have exited Russia. Been more than $280 billion in foreign direct investment that has left Russia. Another $250 billion of capital flight and a significant brain drain of high-tech Russian citizens leaving to work somewhere else. The bottom line is that if that this ceasefire proposal, the ceasefire demand, is simply for show. It's just to show the world that Russia has no interest whatsoever in a peace deal, so that the rest of the world can bring more tools to bear against Russia, because the way to end this war is not through negotiations, because Russia doesn't want to negotiate. The way to end this war is not going to be through military hardware. That will take too long and cost too many lives. The fastest way to end this war is to absolutely crush Russia's economy. And that is exactly what the United States should be working to do, and the Western world. We don't, I mean, sending military hardware to keep the Ukrainians afloat while the Russian economy spirals out of control is probably a smart move. If we're spending less than 5% of our defense budget each year on decimating the Russian military, that's money well spent, most likely. Ensures that Russia will not be a threat to us for a long time to come. And all that is to say, don't expect an end to this conflict anytime soon, because it's going to take time for those sanctions to continue to bite, and for the oil prices. Let's just hope oil prices go lower. Every dollar that a barrel of oil drops represents a 4% decrease in the government revenues of the government of Russia. So let's see if President Trump can drop the price of oil by $10 a barrel. And that'd be a 40% decline in Russia's government revenue, and they would not be able to continue prosecuting this war much longer. But they are going to take it to the mat, because Vladimir Putin must win in Ukraine in order for him to survive politically. If he does not win in Ukraine, he will not survive politically. And so he is going to destroy his country and every other country he can get his hands on in order to win this war. And that kind of commitment has to be matched on the side of the West in order for a positive outcome to take place in this war. So, folks, I've got to run. I got to go get on Gary Lane's show, but I just encourage you to like and share this video with your friends. Please go to chuckholton.com if you want to hear more of my reporting, and we'll see you again next time. All right.